All right, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation to be here today. My name's Wesley Glisson. I'm the aquatic plant specialist from the Washington State Department of Ecology. And today I'm going to be talking about invasive aquatic plants in Washington State. So first, I just wanted to give a brief on just aquatic plants in general. A lot of folks, when they see anything in a lake or pond, they think it's automatically bad or an invasive, but that's really not true. Our native aquatic plants, they provide food and habitat for all number of creatures, invertebrates, amphibians, fish, water birds, and mammals. They help maintain water clarity, stabilize shorelines, as well as regulate water chemistry and nutrient flow. We also know that aquatic plants are culturally significant food sources, medicines, and materials. Like just a couple examples are wapido or arrowhead, which are Sagittarius species, which are used for food, monomen or wild rice, Zizania species, especially in the Great Lakes region, as well as cattails or typha species. So not only are these used by wildlife, but also by humans. So this picture, I think, does a really good job of demonstrating what happens when invasive aquatic plants invade a water body. So the picture on the left here is a really nice native plant community. We have a couple of different species. The ones with the wider leaves would be pondweeds. We have some native milfoils in there, as well as some low-growing species. And our native plant communities that are diverse typically harbor a lot of different wildlife species. So these little insets demonstrate different invertebrates and fish, and other creatures that live in and among the native plant beds. And then on the right here is what we typically see when an invasive plant invades a water body. So a monotypic stand where we only see one species that's growing really dense. And typically this provides less favorable habitat for wildlife, invertebrates. And this also causes issues that we see on our lakes, issues with recreation. So these plants grow really thick and dense. They top out at the surface, makes it difficult to enjoy our lakes. These kind of dense invasive plant beds also facilitate things like swimmer's itch and can help facilitate harmful algal blooms as well. So a lot of negative impacts typically come from invasive aquatic plants. So for the meat of my talk here, I'm going to be describing 5 different species of invasive aquatic plants to look out for. And these are kind of some of the most kind of worst of the worst here in Washington. And they are Eurasian water milfoil, variable leaf water milfoil, flowering rush, Brazilian waterweed, and parrot feather. So we'll start off with one that folks are likely familiar with. This is Eurasian water milfoil, or Myriophyllum spicatum. This plant's native to Europe, Asia, and Africa, but it's been in Washington since at least the 1960s, so quite a while. Currently, it's listed as a Class B noxious weed. And what that means is that its distribution is unfortunately pretty widespread in Washington, but in counties or areas where it's not widespread or hasn't been introduced, it's slated for eradication. In other areas, counties can decide whether they want to target this plant for eradication or not. It causes issues in that it actually hybridizes with a native water milfoil species called northern water milfoil. In terms of ID, again, a lot of folks are probably already familiar with this species, but just to go over some of the main ID traits here, it's going to have this column-like shape in the water column. You can see it on the pictures on the right here. It's going to have these finely dissected leaves, and these are typically going to appear in whorls of 4 leaves. I'm going to bring out my pointer here. So this is a typical whorl of leaves. So at each point where there's a leaf along the stem, you're going to have these 4 leaves that are attached. It's going to have these flower stalks that actually appear above the surface, as shown here, with really small flowers. And they actually have really tiny leaves on there too, but you're not typically going to be able to notice them. And one of the characteristics of Eurasian water milfoil, as demonstrated in these pictures, is its ability to grow up through the water column and then top out on the surface. And this is what causes those issues with recreation. This also shades out our native plants, causes a lot of issues on our water bodies. Here's just another photo of how bad these infestations can get. This is actually a hybrid of the Eurasian water milfoil and the native northern water milfoil. So again, it can grow very dense. That's not something you want to take your boat through or certainly swim through. And as you can imagine, those native plants that are underneath that canopy are missing out on light and other nutrients. So in regards to its distribution, both in the US and Washington, a fairly widespread distribution throughout the US. It's been in the US for quite a long time, as well as Washington, particularly on the west side there. So, but what I want to mention is, people might see this and say, okay, it's a lost cause, but Eurasian water milfoil has been eradicated from lakes in Washington. So just because it appears on a lake or water body, it's not a death sentence for that lake. There's things we can do to get rid of those plants, whether it's through physical removal or chemical removal. So moving on, another water milfoil species, this is called variable leaf water milfoil. You can see it has some similarities to Eurasian water milfoil, but I'll go over some of the differences as well. So this species is unique in that it's actually native to the Southeast United States, but it's not native to Washington. It's really popular in the aquarium trade, and that's how it's been able to be moved across the country, and actually to other parts of the world like Europe, where it's invasive as well. It's first found in Washington back in 2006. This species also hybridizes with a native milfoil as well. This is Western water milfoil, which causes, as you can imagine, quite a few issues. It is a Class A noxious weed, so it has a limited distribution in Washington State, and where it occurs, it's required to be eradicated. So again, as I mentioned, superficially, it's similar to Eurasian water milfoil, but a couple key things distinguish it. So it's actually going to have this big flowering stalk that's going to appear above the water. That's going to have these oval-shaped leaves. So you're not going to see that on Eurasian water milfoil or some of the other native water milfoils. And as you can see in this picture, these actually will pop up above the water and then kind of lay down flat. But you can distinctly see these kind of different shaped leaves than the submerged leaves, which look like this, those typical feathery leaves of other water milfoils. Generally, this species is going to have a bushier appearance in the water column, and it's going to have a smaller space between those sets of leaves. Here's just some pictures. These are actually from Europe of how dense these infestations can get. If you look closely, this one, there's actually a little bird that's up on top of these mats of vegetation. So very dense growth, something we don't want to see in Washington waterways for sure. Some more pictures of its infestations and populations here in Washington. This one here is of a drawdown. These plants can actually persist on wet substrate. And then just another picture of how dense those infestations can be in the water column. So in a lot of ways, this is even probably a more aggressive and worse invader than Eurasian water milfoil. Here's its distribution in the US and Washington. As I mentioned, it's actually native to parts of the US, so those areas in orange are its native range, and then areas in that dark brown are where it is non-native, so both in the Northeast and then over here in Washington. And as you can see, it has a fairly limited distribution in Washington. It's only up until just a couple years ago, was only in about 6 lakes. We've now found it in a couple more down in Clark County, but we're trying to stay on top of that and find the extent of those populations and hopefully eradicate those populations there. So I know I'm moving fairly quickly, but I want to get through all these species here. This is one that has been mentioned before, a really high profile species. This is called flowering rush. This one can actually grow both emergent, so above the water, kind of similar to cattails or bulrushes or even sedges that you might see growing at the water's edge, but it can also grow fully submerged in the water. Other species that it might look similar to are water celery or vallisneria. So can grow in a variety of different ways. This one's also native to Europe and Asia, been in Washington since at least the 1990s, likely before then. And this is also listed as a Class A noxious weed, so it is required to be eradicated wherever it occurs. Just a couple ID tips for this plant. Again, superficially, it might look like cattails or some other native species, but some things are going to distinguish it. And that's mainly that it's going to have this triangular stem, and it's actually going to flatten out as it gets towards the tip of the plant, and those tips are going to actually twist. That's something you're not going to see in any of our other native plants. The thing that really distinguishes it is going to actually be these flower clusters, but unfortunately those aren't very common. Some populations flower consistently, others not at all. And you're only going to see those flowers on stems that are actually above the surface of the water. So if you do see something like this, take note of that, give me an email, give me a call, report that as soon as you can. But again, those are not very common. This plant also produces these rhizomes, so that's how it spreads. It actually creeps along the bottom sediment, and then these can actually break off, flow downstream, and start new plants, and they break off fairly easily. So this plant it can grow in a variety of different habitats. It can also colonize areas that don't have any aquatic plants, which causes those issues that Blaine brought up, where you're creating habitat for other invasive species like invasive pike. So creating whole new habitats, and then it can also exist in these shallow kind of mudflat areas, even as areas that are fully dried out. You see this picture down here in this rocky area. So it is a really incredible invader in that it can persist in a lot of different habitats. In terms of its distribution in Washington State, this map has both areas where there have been surveys and it's not been found, as well as areas where it has been found. So these areas marked in red are where it's present. And as you can see, it occurs both along the Columbia River and its tributaries. So here we have the Pend Oreille River, Spokane River, Yakima River. Throughout the Columbia River system, as well as some disparate populations up here in Whatcom County and here at Joint Base Lewis-McChord. So fairly widespread distribution. There's a lot of efforts, coordinated efforts around the state, as well as partnering states in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, to take care of this flowering rush problem. All right, moving right along, Brazilian waterweed, or Agarya densa. Another plant that's not native here, it's native to South America. It's really popular in the aquarium trade and for biology education. So kind of like that variable leaf water milfoil, folks have them in their aquariums, they dump their aquariums or toss out the plants, and then these establish. It's been in the Washington since the 1970s. It's currently listed as a Class B noxious weed. So if you remember, those are ones that are fairly widespread in areas where don't already occur. They're set to be eradicated, but not in areas where they're already widespread. In terms of ID, this can also have kind of a column-like shape in the water, but the things that are going to distinguish it from your milfoils are that it's going to have these simple leaves. So you can see here, these aren't the feathery leaves of milfoil, they're just regular leaves, and they're going to have whorls of 4 as well. So there's some native plants that are going to look similar to this, but they will only have whorls of 3 leaves. So look for those whorls of 4. It's also kind of a pretty thick, bushy plant as well. It occasionally will produce these white flowers, which will be fairly distinct with 3 petals. And here's just some photos of infestation. So again, this is a plant that can fill up the water column, really cause issues for recreation, shading out those native plants. Here's some more photos as well showing its infestations. In terms of its distribution in the United States and Washington, fairly widespread on both coasts. And then here in Washington, pretty much restricted to the west side, but as you can see, in a fair amount of water bodies throughout the west side of Washington. All right, last species here is parrot feather. This is another species of milfoil, but it's quite different than the other 2 that I've mentioned so far. So also native to South America, like Brazilian Agarya, or Brazilian Agarya, or waterweed rather. It's been in Washington since the 1970s. It's also a Class B noxious weed. In terms of ID, a couple of things are going to really distinguish this plant. It's going to have this emergent leaf stalk with these finely dissected leaves. So it looks like this. You're typically going to see it growing along shorelines and kind of creeping into the water as it goes. It has these stems that kind of creep through the water. This plant was brought up on shore. So I have some pictures in the next slide here that show how it grows in the water. It's going to have these whorls of 4 to 6 leaves that wrap around the stems, similar to those other milfoil species. And occasionally you're going to see little flowers at the base of the leaves as well. And as far as we know, there's only female plants in North America. So if you're really interested in looking closely at those flowers, you'll notice that they're only female. So here's some pictures of infestations. Again, as you can see, kind of creeps into the deeper areas from the shallower areas along the shoreline. Here's a good picture here of it kind of extending out into the open water areas, and it can grow fairly dense, as you can see. In terms of its distribution, again, in the United States and Washington, fairly widespread, particularly in the South, and then again on the West Coast. Here it's largely restricted to Western Washington, but there are some populations here throughout Eastern Washington as well. All right, so just a couple more slides here. I know folks have been kind of informed on this previously, but If you see anything that looks out of the ordinary, looks like it might not be native, please report it. There's lots of ways to report. I'll mention just two here. You've probably, either Justin Bush or Maria have mentioned the Washington Invasive Species Council both has a website where you can report this, as well as an app. You can find this in the App Store. Really simple, really easy, it's free. So I encourage folks to get that app and use that if they see anything out of the ordinary. If you have more questions or aren't quite sure, you don't want to use that app, feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and I'll have my info on the last slide here. So send me some pictures, as many as you can take of the plants. Reproductive structures, leaves, all those things are really helpful, as well as the lake that you're on or the water body that you're on. And I'll do my best to be able to help. Sometimes I can even come out and visit too. So lastly, this is probably something that folks are already aware of, but clean, drain, and dry. It's so easy to bring these plants to new water bodies. In the talk we just heard earlier, zebra mussels are also a big issue. These can attach to plants. You can bring zebra mussels by bringing plants. Also things like this here, you're just walking around water bodies too. This is variable leaf water milfoil in my boot. So clean your boots, clean your waders best you can. And then, if you can, leave those equipments and your boats out of the water for a couple of days before going to a new water body as an extra level of safety. This is my info here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today. Again, feel free to get in touch if you have questions or concerns about plants in your lake or just aquatic plants in general. I'm happy to talk about them. So with that, again, I appreciate being here. Thank you.